Winter hit Toronto early in 2007. Fresh snow was all mixed up with mud and grit. Norval was struggling with his health. His Parkinson's disease had advanced. But he had traveled anyway, flown into Toronto with his adopted son Gabe to continue his fight against the forgeries. But then his health took a turn.
He'd been in hospital the year before, and so it was another trip to the hospital, and there was hope that he would get on the mend. And so we felt very positive. It went from, I was very hopeful, and then it went to really, really dark and sad. And death, right? Death comes.
Norval Morriseau was one of this country's finest, and he died this morning at the age of 75 after a long battle with Parkinson's.
He introduced the world to contemporary Aboriginal Canadian art.
He wasn't just an artist, he founded an entire art movement. Norval Morriseau was responsible for what was commonly called the Woodland School.
He was called the Picasso of the North.
The man who turned Anishinaabe legends into great works of art has passed into the realms of legends himself.
Norval died while trying to defend his legacy. But the fight over the forgeries was just getting started. From CBC in Canada and ABC in Australia, this is Forged. Episode 4, The Interveners.
Going into the trial, I frankly thought that we had an extremely strong case.
Jonathan Sommer, Kevin Hearn's lawyer, was prepared to go to trial and claim that by lying about the authenticity of Kevin's painting, Joe McLeod had made a fraudulent misrepresentation. That Joe had knowingly sold Kevin a fake. Joe continued to deny this. He filed a statement of defense, saying so. He says that Norval was an alcoholic and sick, and that many of his works didn't have secure provenance. Joe says that he has a relationship with Norval's children. He says that he had Morrisseau paintings reviewed by a forensic examiner to determine if the handwriting on the backside of the paintings was Norval's, that he had handwriting samples of Norval's and a signature of Norval's in a letter that he wrote. Joe says that neither he nor his gallery were authenticating fake Morrisseaus, that they weren't forging his works, and that they weren't part of some large fraud scheme. This was all submitted to the court. But then, right before the trial was set to begin, Joe died.
I expected that we would easily be able to prove that the painting was a fake, and part of that confidence was because basically there was no other side. McLeod had passed away. So it was a bit of a strange situation where they had not conceded defeat, which meant that we would have to go to trial, but there wasn't going to be any active opposition in the case. But that changed because when we got to the trial, the first day, there were a number of individuals who decided they wanted to be interveners in the case.
You might not have heard of interveners before. That's because they're really uncommon.
It happens, but it's very unusual in civil litigation.
An intervener is a person who has a vested interest in the outcome of a case and wants to be involved in the litigation. Judges approve or reject interveners on a case-by-case basis. And in Kevin's case, there were a lot of people who had vested interests. People who wanted to stop the fakes from being proven in court.
All the people who say there are no fakes are people who are deeply financially invested in Norval Morriseau paintings. They've invested money and they stand to gain or lose a lot depending on the outcome of this stuff.
If Kevin's painting was proven to be a fake, The impact would ripple through the market, would affect the worth of other paintings that had the same red flags as Kevin's. So the owners of these paintings, of the questionable Morrisseaus, they stood to lose a lot of money. Outside of Kevin's trial, this whole cast of characters who were saying there are no fakes were involved in other lawsuits, suing anyone or any entity calling out questionable Morrisseau paintings.
We were ambushed on our first day of court by a fellow named Jim White and the couple called the Goldies. They wanted to become interveners and step in for Joe McLeod, and things just went upside down.
The judge presiding over the case, Justice Edward Morgan, granted Jim White intervener status.
Jim White, it was quite clear that he owned a large number of black dry brush paintings that are of the same species as the one that was being disputed in the case. And so essentially his argument was, if this case decides that Kevin Hearn's painting is fake, then that will negatively affect the market value of my collection.
And then this other guy, Nathaniel Bigcanoe, he became an intervener too. The judge laid out his reasoning, saying that, quote, "I cannot help but think that the cause of justice will be advanced if there are two sides facing off in this trial." So the interveners became part of the defense.
When I began, I thought I was continuing a conversation with Joe McLeod, but I was actually going up against a network of people.
And in that network of people were John and Joan Goldie. John Goldie had actually applied to be an intervener too, but the judge had rejected him.
The Goldies, John and Joan Goldie, were part of a group of people who very publicly took the position that there were no fakes, that the whole attempt to expose the fraud was in itself a fraud. They are collectors of black dry brush paintings, and they were also dealers.
The Goldies had a website, and they would consistently put up on their website what we would now call alternative news. And they were spreading misinformation about the art fraud and, blaming it on people like anyone who stood up to the fakes, They would follow Jonathan and I and take photos of us. They posted photos of my daughter, who's disabled, online, saying I was a bad father. Yeah, and they harassed Carmen Robertson.
Carmen Robertson, the art historian and Kevin's expert witness. Kevin had sent her his painting to analyze.
I received the painting in question. It spent 6 months in my house, and I looked at it closely and wrote an extensive report related to that. I knew it was a fake from the moment I saw it. I had no qualms about that in any way.
But before she could explain why to the court, Carmen started to get harassed too.
The Goldies had created a fake email address that they called Roxanne Spritzer, and they sent out emails to universities and public art institutions across Canada saying that I was a discredited researcher. It just kind of went on and on and on. My family, I was concerned about them, and I just didn't know that it was worth it to continue on with this. It was incredibly stressful. I wasn't sleeping. I was barely eating. And I just thought, I just don't think I can carry on with this.
She was very concerned. She felt that she was being threatened, that her livelihood was being threatened. We were barreling towards trial. And then she sort of says, I can't do this. I can't be subjected to all this. So Kevin and I put a lot of effort into talking to her, convincing her that it was important what she was doing, but also then making certain promises regarding measures we were going to take in terms of protecting her security, and that included the bodyguard.
It was a very strange thing. A great guy, huge big guy, who walked with me to the courtroom.
Years later, Jonathan would sue the Goldies. The judge in that ruling described the Goldies' harassment as, quote, a systemic and ongoing campaign. But despite all the harassment, Kevin Hearn's case continued. And Carmen did go to court. She decided this case was too important.
There was no sense anymore of what Morrisseau's incredible visual language legacy was about, because the market was being flooded. And I just felt that as an art historian, it was really important to try to set that record straight. I just was very focused on, listening closely, telling my part of the story, and looking at the really horrendous painting that was being passed off as an original Morrisseau.
And so the trial began at the Superior Court in downtown Toronto, with Carmen there and the Goldies too.
They would show up at all the court hearings and disrupt things and hiss at me.
There was a lot that was going around this court. The bodyguard made sure that I walked on the inside of the sidewalk, and I asked him why, and he said, well, because if somebody comes up on the sidewalk and tries to, hit you, I want to make sure that they hit me first. And I was shocked by that.
Carmen gave her testimony, describing what she saw in the painting that made her think it was a fake.
It was never a green that Morrisseau painted with, and that was the main color of background, and the many beings that were sort of floating around like sperm-like amoebas or something like that. It's the kind of work that you'd buy to put over your couch in a living room, because it would fit in nicely with the kinds of colors that are harmonious in a way that you might find at a Lazy Boy furniture store. So that was not the kind of work that Morrisseau did. His use of color had nothing to do with pleasing connections. His work was based on color as medicine. It was not meant to be pleasing pictures that would go well with your interior design. And one of the things that is really noticeable when you see a group of works that are not by Morrisseau but have his name on them is that they're devoid of story. They seem blank, and there's no life or energy to them. He put the paint colors on, and then he used the black outline to unite it all. And that was not what was happening in this work that Kevin Hearn had. It was such a boring work. I mean, it's a pretty picture. I will agree to that. But it's just not one that was by Morrisseau.
And then there was the provenance. Carmen's independent findings echoed Kevin's investigation.
I had contacted all the so-called previous owners of this work and very easily realized that the people either didn't exist or they'd never owned or heard of this particular painting. From an art historical perspective, if the provenance documentation is invalid, then that is a pivotal evidence as to it being fake.
Carmen was on the stand for nearly 2 days, detailing all the reasons she believed Kevin's painting was a fake. And after she took the stand, there were others. Dallas Thompson testified. He stated in court that Gary Lamont was producing fake Morrisseau paintings, and he testified about the assaults. Kevin's lawyer Jonathan called on witnesses like the art shop owner Lorraine Call, who spoke about all the art supplies Gary bought from her. Norval's sworn declarations were presented in court, showing how Norval himself had been trying to fight the fakes for years, before Kevin had even bought his painting. Jonathan set out to convince the court that Kevin's painting was a fake. He also wanted to prove the existence of a fraud ring in Thunder Bay, and suggest that the painting may have come from there. The trial dragged on over a period of 5 months. Despite the tension in and out of the court, the need for a bodyguard, Kevin and Jonathan were feeling good about their case.
When I made our closing arguments, I thought we had absolutely decimated the other side. And I'm not usually like that. I'm pretty cautious about things. And I finished that trial and I thought, man, we nailed it. We just won by a massive margin. And then the waiting began.
When Jonathan contacted me and told me we had lost, I thought he was joking. But he wasn't. He was distraught, and so was I.
When we got the decision and saw that we had lost, I was absolutely gobsmacked. Like I felt felt surreal. I felt like I was in another universe where somebody else had gone to a trial and screwed up. And this was the result. Like it just felt completely crazy wrong.
Well, it really did feel like the Twilight Zone because I just assumed that it was kind of a slam dunk. It really did feel like, well, what the heck is going on here?
This is how he starts his decision. The plaintiff, Kevin Hearn, has a good ear for music. Does he have a good eye for art fraud?
That's the first line of the judge's ruling.
Like condescending right from the get-go.
And then the judge writes, if he, Kevin, had $1 million, or at least tens of thousands, he would buy a Norval Morriseau.
He started and ended the decision with sort of jokes at Kevin's expense based on his membership in the Bare Naked Ladies.
The judge dismissed Carmen's expert report, saying it was flawed and subjective.
As I read the decision, I saw that he went out after the trial was over and he dug into various philosophical, postmodern, structuralist literature. And so he used those scholarly texts as a counter to Dr. Carmen Robertson's arguments. We were never given any notice of this. We had no way to respond. This was never put to her on the stand, which is what would normally happen in a trial. It's like the trial continued, but we weren't invited.
The judge also stated that Kevin's witnesses, like Dallas Thompson, who testified about Gary Lamont and the existence of a fraud ring, didn't matter much, if at all, to the crux of the case, which was whether Joe McLeod had knowingly sold Kevin a fake. The judge implied that Norval's sworn declarations weren't very useful, that Norval had a shaky lifestyle, so it's no surprise that Kevin's painting had shaky provenance. Ultimately, the judge wrote that, quote, "Spirit energy of Mother Earth is one more painting, an interesting and beautiful one, if I may say so. That is possibly an authentic Norval Morriseau, and possibly not." And the judge declared the case a tie.
And then he said, and in the rules of civil law, a tie goes to the defense. And so we lost the trial.
But there was still a win. In his decision, the judge wrote, "I do not doubt the existence of a Thunder Bay area fraud ring and the circulation of fraudulent paintings produced there."
That was the victory. Even though I lost the case, I won in the sense that the judge admits there was a fraud ring, which was a big domino.
They'd proved the art fraud ring, that fake Morrisseau paintings were being made in Thunder Bay. They just hadn't proved that Kevin's painting was one of them.
I was feeling exhausted and discouraged. I went to speak to Len Glickman, who is a lawyer for the Bare Naked Ladies. I knew him quite well as a friend. And he said, "Kevin, if you don't appeal this, you'll wonder for the rest of your life what would have happened."
So Kevin appealed the decision. And about 1.5 years later, there was news.
And I remember getting the call I was walking along Queen Street. I got the call that I'd won the appeal and that they had overturned Justice Morgan's decision. And I remember feeling a weight lifting off my shoulders, that I'd known it was there, but I hadn't really been able to quantify it but until I felt it lift. And I remember jumping up in the air.
The appeal judges wrote that Justice Morgan, the judge who ruled over the initial decision, made errors in judging this case.
One of them was that they deeply disapproved of his doing research after the trial was over and then using that research as a way of impeaching and disagreeing with our expert witness.
The Court of Appeal agreed that Kevin was entitled to two things: a real Morrisseau painting and valid provenance documents. It said that Justice Morgan misunderstood the importance of having valid and traceable provenance for the painting. The court didn't make a decision about whether Kevin's painting was real, but it did decide that the documents that Joe McLeod gave him were likely fake. And the court agreed that Kevin had not been given what he was promised. The appeal judges concluded with an observation about Justice Morgan's references to Kevin's band in his decision, calling it, quote, an ill-advised attempt at humor, and that the judge's comments were, quote, inappropriate and unnecessary. Kevin won the appeal and was awarded $60,000.
Well, I bought the painting for $20,000. Proving the truth probably cost me 5 times that, at least. The money part of it didn't matter. Through my appeal lawyers, I contacted Joe McLeod's estate and said, why don't we take that money and donate it to an Indigenous cause and make something good out of this? But I never received a reply or the money.
We reached out to Justice Morgan, the judge in Kevin's initial trial, and gave him the opportunity to respond to what is said about him in this episode. His judicial assistant told us that his reasons for judgment are published, and sitting judges are not available for interviews. We also contacted the intervener in Kevin's trial, Jim White, through his lawyer, but received no reply. And we tried to reach the Goldies by email and phone and mail, but we were unable to reach them before this episode went to air. Kevin was never able to trace who actually painted Spirit Energy of Mother Earth. Maybe Gary was responsible. Maybe it did come from his fraud ring in Thunder Bay. But there was a bigger picture coming into focus, of fraud rings, plural. And a cold case murder.
When we started, the hope was we were going to get information to help us solve the murder of Scott Dove. But we started getting all this information on an art fraud that happened. And so I was like, how has nobody ever looked into this? Are the two connected? Like, that's kind of how it started. Is there a connection to the art fraud and the murder? And, you know, when I talked to Jonathan Summer, kind of the floodgates opened, right?
That's on the next episode of Forged. Forged is a co-production of CBC in Canada and ABC in Australia. It was produced by Kyle Musica and showrunner Zoe Tennant. Our contributing reporter is Luke Rinaldi. Additional production support from Rudy Bremer and Anna Marie Harding. Our contributing editor is Phelan Johnson, and our senior producer and story editor is Veronica Simmons. Sound design and original music by Graham McDonald. Emily Metu is our fact-checker. Roshni Nair is our coordinating producer. At CBC Podcasts, executive producers are Cecil Fernandez and Chris Oak. Tanya Springer is the senior manager, and Arif Nurani is director. Special thanks to the CBC Indigenous Office. At ABC, Calric Martin and Jessica Radburn are executive producers.